So our third speaker is Leah Temper. Leah is a research associate in the Leadership for the Ecozoic program at McGill, where she teaches and does Oh, I'm back. I was frozen. So Leah, we'll get started before I freeze again. I said amazing things about you. Would you mind just go ahead and sharing your screen?
Sure.
And then we'll get started.
Okay.
The Zoom life, hashtag Zoom life, right?
Hold on, let me do this and share and play the slideshow. Okay.
Great. So take it away. Thank you.
So you can all see me and the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, John and Matt and Meg, and it's great to follow you both. And in particular, Matt, your presentation, I think they really complement each other well, because what I'm actually talking about today is the socio-environmental costs and impacts of energy from a supply perspective. And I'm going to be kind of assessing the state of knowledge and doing a systematic mapping of projects both against fossil fuels and low carbon energy projects. Oh, and also I have to congratulate you on the prop. It made me think that the next presentation I'd like to do it with a puppet show or something, because today I'll be having a lot of, boring graphs and whatnot, because I'll be presenting some statistical analyses. So this work, it was actually inspired, I don't know if Ellie Perkins was able to make it on the call today. I should mention that I have, I think, some co-authors that are still with us. I know Bertotti, I saw she was here. And there's also Jen Gabi from the E4A, who is another co-author on this paper. And this paper was partly inspired by a request made by Ellie Perkins. She's one of the co-authors of a chapter in the upcoming IPCC report. And for the first time, the next report is focusing a little bit more on some of the social aspects of the energy transition. So until the present, the IPCC has really been focused on understanding the physical science of climate change. And there's been a lot less work done on understanding and sort of systematic review, evidence synthesis on, what policies work and what are the different social levers in moving towards energy transition. So this next report is going to tackle this for the first time. And I coordinate and direct a global database that's called the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice, that to date has about 3,200 documented conflicts and socio-environmental mobilizations against different projects. So Ellie contacted me and said, since there's a dearth of data of academic literature on this type of social mobilization, can we do a systematic review of these cases in the Atlas to better understand how communities are responding to different energy projects and how this intersects with different types of climate justice activism. So that was the motivation for the project. And I think another motivation, of course, and this has really come to the fore now with this release of this Michael Moore film, A Planet of the Humans that has really raised the debate about the different costs of renewable energies, is to show a little bit in clearer detail some of the sacrifice zones of this new green energy economy. And I think that it needs to be done in a way that's a little bit more nuanced and fact-based than documentary films such as this one, and really showing these social aspects as well as some of this technical aspects that have been more focused. So the database that I manage serves, I think, that purpose well beyond an individual case study approach, because there has been a lot of work done in a case study approach, but this kind of provides the opportunity to do a broader analysis. And the other thing is that this, so this section, this is actually a contribution to a special issue in Environmental Research Letters that's supposed to serve as an input to the IPCC report. And this special issue is really focused, as most of the policy responses have been, on demand side solutions. And so the movements that I'm talking about today, they're actually can be considered supply side movements. They're really looking at, you know, their place-based mobilizations against different types of energy projects. And I think what they do bring out is this need for this broader understanding of demand. So when we talk about or think about aggregate demand, it's often thinking about, you know, how citizens express their preferences in the markets through dollars. But I like to think about demand also how, you know, different ways that demands are expressed, kind of protest demands or collective demands, and what, you know, how we can also, when we think about demand, take into account these non-monetary ways that citizens express their demands, and also the energy futures that they would like to have. And I think analyzing these type of protests is one way to get at this question. So the research questions that I'm looking at is really to understand the scope and scale of these place-based movements that are contesting different types of energy projects. I want to understand which groups are most impacted by different project types, how governments are responding to these citizen protests, whether these movements are actually successful or not at stopping energy projects. And I'm going to be doing throughout, you'll see I have different categories of energy projects I look at, but also a sort of broad comparison between fossil fuel projects and low carbon energy projects. And my hypothesis going into this was that, you know, fossil fuel projects would be actually more intense and conflictive than low carbon energy projects. And then sort of these broader questions about how these movements might shape the transition to a low carbon economy. So the methodology I used is called systematic mapping. It's an evidence synthesis method that can some ways be seen as a prior step to a systematic review because it really hopes to understand the state of knowledge of a particular question or topic. So it's sort of an initial stage of collating and describing the available evidence, and it can then lead to, in a second stage, sort of other systematic reviews or more in-depth research questions. And if you want to read one paper sort of that lays out this methodology for environmental sciences, you can see it below. And the database I was using, as I mentioned, was the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice. It's a project that I've been managing for about 8 years now. To date, it's collected 3,144 different cases of socio-ecological mobilizations against specific projects across many different categories. And I'll show you how we did sort of the review and filtering process to get at the cases that we wanted to see. So this is kind of showing the process. At the time when we first downloaded the database, it had 2,900 cases. And the first thing we did was that we only took cases after 1997. We use that as the cutoff because it's the year of the Kyoto Protocol that went into action. And then we screened the documents according to the different filter criteria regarding the energy projects only that we wanted to look at. So the result, here just to get an idea of the type of projects that I looked at and how they were organized, was that I had 4 categories under fossil fuel projects, 160 on oil and gas extraction and refining, 138 on coal mining and thermal power plants, 38 on pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure, and 35 on fracking specifically. And in low carbon energy projects, we had 160 for hydropower, 57 for biomass and land-based mitigation strategies, 22 for nuclear energies, and 39 for other renewable energies, which includes wind, solar, and geothermal. Oh, how am I doing for time? I can't see.
You're good. You got maybe 5 or 6 minutes?
Okay.
Halfway?
Okay, so let's look at some of the results. The first result is that both types of projects and across all categories, there are disproportionate impacts on certain vulnerable populations. The most significant of these is indigenous populations. And indigenous peoples are involved in almost 50% of cases across both categories. And this is startling considering that they represent about 3% of the global population. And actually, there's greater involvement of indigenous peoples in low carbon energy projects than in fossil fuel projects. And you can see this chart shows a few of the differences amongst categories. For example, conflicts projects such as fracking or nuclear energy have much lower participation of indigenous peoples than other projects. Similarly, these projects are almost highly concentrated in rural areas, which is something we already knew. Most energy is consumed in urban areas, but it's produced in rural communities, leading to a huge disconnect from the sites of production and consumption of the energy. And again, there's some differences amongst categories. Of course, hydropower and biomass are almost entirely located in rural communities, whereas some projects such as nuclear energy, oil and gas refining, so on and so forth, and coal thermal power plants are more likely to be located in urban communities. And also regarding the distribution of these cases amongst different countries according to their income level, these are World Bank classifications. We also see that low carbon energy projects are even more, or low carbon energy conflicts, we should say, are even more likely to be located in low income countries, and fossil fuel projects are more likely to be located in high income countries. And regarding the intensity of these projects, again, we don't see significant differences between fossil fuel and between low carbon energy projects. So the ones that have the most high intensity projects include nuclear, coal, but also hydropower, pipelines, and fracking. we do notice that the sort of lowest intensity conflicts are those related to other renewable energies. Here's just a quick comparison. And finally, we also look at what are the different repressive outcomes of these type of conflicts. And so this includes, how often do we see the death of activists who are mobilizing, or the deaths of protesters in these cases? How often do we see the criminalization of activists or general repression against protesters? And the rates of repression are extremely high in both types of cases. Actually, in about 10% of cases, you have an activist killed, which is very significant. And here again, we see that actually repressive outcomes are even more likely in low carbon energy projects than in fossil fuel conflicts, which is sort of quite disturbing. There's this association that, green energy also comes with better corporate and social behavior. And I think this, shows that governments and corporate actors are willing to push through these projects at any cost, the same as other extractive projects. Here you can see across categories some of the differences regarding the different types of repressive responses. So for example, with pipeline mobilizations, criminalization of activists is very common. And then death of activists are very high in coal mining conflicts and in hydropower conflicts, leading to close to, between 10 and 20% of those cases, we see the deaths of activists occurring. And migration and displacement of communities is highest in biomass and land conflicts and in hydropower conflicts. And finally, this is the last, oh yes, the good news. So the good news, or the takeaway, is that there actually is a really high degree of success of stopping these projects when movements are mobilizing against them. So this chart is showing the percent of projects across each category that have either been canceled or suspended for a long time, or that the company has withdrawn from the project. And so the average across all projects, is about 25%. So about, or a little bit more than 25%. So about 1 in 4 projects are being canceled. And in some categories, it's even higher. So this really shows, that movements, when mobilizing, are, having considerable success at stopping these socially and environmentally damaging projects. So what are the conclusions and the takeaways? So the big one is that the differences in intensity, violence, and the groups impacted by fossil fuel and low carbon energy projects are not as significant as we might have thought. So low carbon energy projects are replicating the same violent colonial patterns of extractive projects, and they're operating really according to the same logics. And this is something we're developing, this concept of extract mentality, which really refers to this, concept of disposability of the populations involved, and this externalization of these social and environmental costs onto them. Another interesting finding is that, I mean, most of these groups are not very concerned about climate change impacts. So the mobilization is really driven, and this is more so in the global south. There's differences, of course, in the global north, where you have many of these place-based mobilizations that are more focused on global impacts and concerns about climate change. But most of these cases are more motivated by the local social and environmental impacts. So some other takeaways is that this high rate of project cancellation really suggests that this risk of stranded assets is real. So, you know, these projects have very high failure rates. And I think that often it's actually these social constraints which are leading these projects to fail rather than technical constraints. And I think it calls for, you know, more now moving here more a little bit to the policy side, that it calls for supply side mechanisms, and that social movements and social mobilizations should help inform what are the places and where oil needs to be left under the soil. And then following what Matt was saying about energy sufficiency and reduction of supply, as well as relocalization of energy production and downscaling of energy intensive activities. So it shows also that, you know, from a social perspective, a huge large scale shift to renewable energies will not be socially acceptable due to the social costs and the protests that we see as a result. So, you know, one way forward is increasing energy democracy and a decentralization of energy systems, really reducing the length of the commodity chains of where energy is produced and where it's used. And of course, the last one, of course, is the need for strengthened legal protections for Indigenous communities and support for Indigenous governance. So I'll leave it there and happy to discuss. Oh, and this is